So if you were to look back on your childhood, what do you think would be the best birthday present your parents ever got you? That hot new toy? A pair of the top-of-the-line sneakers everyone was wearing? A new car? Well, whatever it is, odds are Daniel Bradman has you beat. For this comic fan's father didn't just buy his son a comic for his bar mitzvah, he made his son a comic character and teamed him with Superman. So let's go back to the late 1980s and find out how a British real estate magnate, a future Emmy-winning producer, a Mad Magazine artist, and a legendary Superman artist led to the creation of what is now considered to be one of the rarest Superman comics ever. This is Geodfrey Bradman, real estate magnate worth hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion. Ergo, he has a lot of money. If you heavily follow the British real estate scene, you will likely know his name. But while his achievements in real estate are probably the most impressive thing about him to most people, the most interesting thing he likely ever did has nothing to do with British real estate and everything to do with America's most famous superhero. For you see, in 1988, Geodfrey's son Daniel was about to turn 13 years old. Being Jewish, the young Bradman turning 13 meant one thing: a bar mitzvah, a Jewish celebration of a boy's 13th birthday as they recognize him becoming an adult. It's a huge deal marked by a huge party, but when that boy's father is as rich as Bruce Wayne, the pressure's likely on to provide a great gift for your son, and Geodfrey had just the thing for a true one-of-a-kind present. See, his son Daniel was a comic book fan, and I would think his dad could have bought him just about any comic he wanted, but he went one step further. For he contacted DC Comics Special Projects Department and inquired about making a custom comic featuring Daniel, his friend Andrew Hunt, and the rest of the Bradman family in smaller roles. Now, DC being contacted to do a custom comic was nothing new in and of itself. Both DC and Marvel, along with other companies, had been doing it for quite some time. But previously, the customs were used to promote a product, such as the TSR-80 comics that came out featuring Superman and were glorified ads for computers, or to promote a PSA-style message, most famously the Teen Titans anti-drug PSA comics, which may one day be the subject of its own video. All of these are known to have large print runs and be widely distributed. Having an individual contact them to do a comic book simply featuring someone's son as a present that's loan distribution would be at one party celebrating his birthday was not something that had ever been done before. But Geodfrey had something DC liked: money, and a lot of it, as Geodfrey reportedly paid DC Comics £10,000, which was about $18,000 at the time. Some might be thinking, getting your son in a comic for only $18,000 doesn't actually seem like that much, but adjusted for inflation, it comes to $43,989.54. In other words, more than a lot of people make in a year. So he definitely was willing to shell out quite a bit of money to get this for his son. And for DC, that was a price they were definitely willing to work something out for. So a deal between DC Comics and Bradman was struck. The next step for DC was to find out who would be doing the writing and art for this project. For art duties on this unique one-of-a-kind project that likely got a double take from some people involved when explaining what they would be doing would fall to the legendary Superman artist Curt Swan. Swan began working for DC Comics in 1945 after World War II ended, and after doing a variety of comic characters, he began drawing for the Superman comics in 1948 with Superman 51, and eventually went on to become the artist most associated with Superman during the Silver Age of comics, but he contributed covers and artwork for Superman all the way to 1985. If a DC fan were to think of Superman in the pre-Crisis era, at least visually, there's a good chance they're thinking of a Curt Swan Superman. However, in 1985, after Crisis, and with DC wanting to revamp Superman under writer and artist John Byrne, one of the biggest things they did at the time was to release Swan from the Superman titles. By 1988, he had returned to penciling two-page stories featured in Action Comics, but with a lot more time on his hands, Swan seemingly was more than able to slip in the 8 pages that would be required to pencil Bradman's Superman story. To ink the story would be Angelo Torres, an artist who worked for many comic book companies over the years such as Atlas Comics and EC Comics, but is easily most well known for his artwork in Mad Magazine from the 60s all the way up to 2005. His work for DC Comics was not as prolific, although Although he did do another custom comic for DC Comics for Honda and the U.S. Department of Transportation starring Supergirl. Perhaps it was his involvement in that got him picked for this book, or possibly his friendship with then executive editor of DC Comics Joe Orlando. But whatever it was, Torres was assigned to ink Swan's pencils in what was the only time the two artists would work together on a project. As inker, Torres was responsible for making sure the Bradman family and Andrew Hunt's likenesses were present in the artwork based off of photos he was given. But the writer of this comic is where the story gets even more unusual, and this is already an unusual story. For this story, with artwork by two legendary comic artists, came to be written by David Levin. And if you have not heard of David Levin, and you likely haven't, or if you have, it's not due to his work as a comic book writer, don't feel too bad. This story of Daniel Bradman meeting Superman was the first comic book story written by David Levin. He only wrote one other after that. So how did someone with no prior experience as a comic book writer end up writing his first and ultimately one of only two comic book stories in this unique project? That story is almost as odd as the story of how this comic came to be. Prior to getting hired by DC Comics, Levin had worked as a supervising producer for a small production company when he applied to DC. DC Comics was looking for a writer for a new licensed comic book title they were starting. Levin interviewed for the job and was hired, and quickly went back to give his 2 weeks' notice to his previous employers. After leaving his current job and going to DC to start his new writing job, he was met by editor Barry Marks with the welcoming, "What are you doing here?" He reminded them that they hired him, and then found out some less than good news. The comic that he was hired to write for fell through and would not be made, and thus DC didn't have a job for him anymore. Seems in all the commotion someone forgot to, call him. Oops. As a small consolation, DC told him he could stick around as a freelance writer for the next couple of weeks, and did give him work during that time. The first project was this Island Bradman, and while I'm sure he would have rather had the job he was hired for, there are worse consolation prizes than writing a Superman comic to be drawn by the man who was at the time considered the pinnacle and most definitive Superman artist. So with the motley crew of a legendary Superman artist, an artist from Mad Magazine on inky duties, and a writer who had never written a comic book before, the trio got to work. What came out of it was an 8-page story featuring Superman teaming up with Daniel Bradman and Andrew Hunt. Apparently 10,000 pounds still didn't buy you a full-length book. While this story was written in 1988, i.e. into the post-crisis Superman era of comics, Levin stated in an interview this was written as a pre-crisis Superman. I decided I was writing the Silver Age figure and not the John Byrne Superman. Don't get me wrong, I love John Byrne's version, but he needed to be the hero we'd all heard of for decades. While the biggest side of this is Curt Swan's artwork, the only real storyline indicator of it being the pre-crisis Superman was the level of his powers, which were a little bit more on the godlike specter they were at the time. The story featured Superman being captured by a giant robot alien with a cage in his chest, which Levin admitted he was not thrilled by the design of the robot, but I feel it fits to the campy nature of the story pretty good. He's then taken to an intergalactic zoo of sorts, where inhabitants of other planets are put on display for the aliens' amusement. Presumably Superman was picked due to being the last living Kryptonian, which he wouldn't actually be if this is the pre-crisis Superman. Is Supergirl, the inhabitants of the bottled city of Kandor, the Phantom Zone, and Krypto say hi. But they had 8 pages to tell the story, so I'll let that slide. He then briefly meets Daniel and the rest of the Bradman family, who Levin made sure to have Geodfrey introduce every member of by name. Turns out Superman was put in a cage with the Bradman clan, and Daniel's friend Andrew, along with the mansion and a menagerie of animals. Seemingly having been there longer than Superman, they filled him in on the situation. I do want to take a minute to say I love Swan's artwork for the panels showing the zoo. Beautifully detailed and showed, despite this being a comic made for an insanely tiny audience, they did not phone it in. After being filled in, Superman tries to break them out, but discovered the aliens have installed a kryptonite beam to keep him from being able to escape. An earthquake then breaks out, one the aliens create to give the audience a show, and Geodfrey tells the kids to get inside, even though they would be safer outside in an earthquake, but whatever. This was written by a New Yorker, so good chance he never experienced an earthquake. Superman stops the quake, and Superman and the Bradmans try to devise a plan on how to get out of the cage and back to Earth. Daniel tells him about an air duct he found while exploring that leads them out of the dome. However, it has kryptonite booby traps, so Superman himself is not able to go through the air duct. Given the size of it, Daniel and Andrew decide they should go down the duct and try to find a way to disable the cage. Geodfrey tries to stop them, but Superman holds him back, saying they're the best chance and lets them go into danger, which I gotta admit, sounds like something the pre-crisis Superman would do. The boys slide down the duct and then manage to find a master control panel due to the directions Superman gave them using his supervision. They encounter a guard, but Andrew distracts him while Daniel turns off the power to the cage. With the kryptonite beam now disabled, Superman is able to easily capture the alien zookeeper and presumably gets them to let the Bradmans and the alien captives go. Superman then flies the Bradmans and their home, along with their many animals, back to Earth. He mentions how they couldn't have escaped without Daniel and Andrew, giving the birthday boy the credit for saving the day as DC promised Geodfrey, then flies away promising to come back soon. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. Obviously, this is a pretty straightforward story. It's short, and its main design was to be a birthday present for Daniel, so the creative team's main job was to tell a story while ticking off several boxes. Daniel and Andrew must work with Superman. The rest of the Bradman clan would appear in cameos with everyone's likeness drawn in, and Daniel would save the day. Done, done, and done. This won't win any awards for great storytelling, but for what it was a serviceable story, and it didn't feel like anyone else didn't try. This book was written for Daniel, not the masses after all. The comic also included a reprint of Superman #2 by John Byrne and a cover gallery to fill it out. Levin titled the story This Island Bradman, after the cult classic sci-fi film This Island Earth. It's unclear how many copies of This Island Bradman were actually published. In the book 75 Years of DC Comics, written by Paul Levitz, it was reported only 200 issues were printed, but that was not an official number, and no one seems to know for sure how many were made. Numbers have ranged from 50 copies to 350 copies, although most figure it was likely closer to the 200 reported in the book, most of which were either given to Geodfrey to pass out at Daniel's bar mitzvah, and a few were being distributed to DC employees. After writing This Island Bradman, Levin went on to write a Maxwell Lord story that was published as a DC bonus book, which were stories published by DC at the time as sort of comics within a main comic that showcased new writers and artists. The story was published in Justice League International 24 with art by Dan Haspel. Although if anyone's thinking of going to DC Universe Infinite or Comixology to check out the Maxwell Lord story for yourself, I'll tell you now that while Justice League International 24 is available on both platforms, the bonus book is sadly not included. While working for DC Comics, Levin also wrote the children's books Superman, The Story, and Superman Double Trouble for British publisher Ladybird. But that's why he didn't try to stay on longer at DC and continue to freelance for them. Levin told Back Issue Magazine, "I was starstruck and struck shy. People like Julius Schwartz, Neil Adams, Joe Kerber, Mike Carlin, and John Byrne were walking down the hall. Robert Kanigher was still there. Everybody was very nice, but I couldn't function. I just couldn't open my mouth. But don't worry, Levin did okay for himself, going on to become a very successful writer, producer, and director for television, most notably MTV, for which he became much better known for. As the years went on, This Island Bradman became something of an urban legend among comic book fans. With so few issues printed, and most of them likely not surviving long as they were basically given out as party favors to kids, no images of the book surfaced, nor was any proof of its existence available on the early days of the internet. So many comic fans started to doubt if this fabled story of a comic book written specifically for a millionaire's son with only a few hundred issues was even true. But in time, copies of the book did surface. Comics began to show up at auctions, as well as occasionally popping up on eBay, always selling for thousands of dollars, with the most high-profile sell being sold to a French collector at auction for $5,000. There's also a video on YouTube of famous comic book writer Mark Waid showing off his own copy of the comic he obtained while working for DC Comics. You can check that video out in the link in the description below. How many copies of this comic are out there today is unknown. Most of them were given to kids who likely didn't think much of it, if they even read it, and it's a good bet most of them were either thrown away or destroyed a long time ago. And most copies that have surfaced that can be traced back to their original owners seem to be copies that belong to Levin himself or other staff members at DC Comics. So despite it being a relatively new comic, with the likelihood most copies didn't survive and there being such a small print run to begin with, most would agree that This Island Bradman is a likely candidate for rarest Superman comic of all. And as Mark Wayne points out, it's easily the rarest Superman comic of his lifetime. And that's the story of how a comic book that came about on the most unusual circumstances, created by a legendary artist, a Mad Magazine illustrator, and a future TV producer, meant to only ever be seen by a 13-year-old and his friends, became one of the most talked about rare Superman comics of all time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. You can click on the thumbnail on your right for more videos on obscure comic history, and you can click on the thumbnail on your left to see my most recent video. I'm Dan the Man, and I'll see you next time.